Welcome back once again, philosophy students. This is our second to last class, class number 13 for April the 20th, Monday. And it is in this class that we finish up our consideration of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. We're going to be looking at the essay that he has in the second half of his book entitled Logotherapy in a Nutshell. People had asked him, apparently, after he wrote the first essay, if he could explain a little bit more about the theory that was underlying his essay and some of the analyses in the first part of the essay. What theory was it that enabled him to get through the experiences that he and the other prisoners had in the concentration camp? So this is what he tries to explain in a somewhat more academic, somewhat more theoretical fashion. So you won't find this second essay, the second part of the book, you won't find that it reads in the same way. You won't find it quite as smooth or quite as easy to read. It's a little bit more technical, but not by any stretch exceedingly technical, and not something that students of your level of maturity and your caliber can't appreciate if you just work at it just a little bit. All right. So Frankl deals with a number of issues as he goes through, and he gives us several interesting examples, which we'll talk about. Of course, not surprisingly, he emphasizes very early in this essay, as early as page 99, just a couple of pages in, that what motivates us as human beings, what our primary motivation is our search for meaning. Now, sometimes we might characterize this as a search for truth. What's the truth about life? What's the truth about ourselves? What's the truth about the world? And oftentimes we search for the answer to this truth in the religious quest, which is perfectly natural for the human being. Frankl is essentially characterizing this same search as the human being's attempt to figure out for him or herself what it is that makes life meaningful. And it's a motivating factor. It keeps us going. It keeps us going through all of the different kinds of experiences that we have in our life, which do change and do differ depending upon our age. What you've gone through previously, what you're going through now, what your life will bring you in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and many of you will live into your 90s. Your search for meaning will be somewhat different. Now, it might not be exceedingly different. It might not be fundamentally different. You might look back on your life as a teenager or in your early 20s and say, well, I'm essentially on the same path, right? But all through our lives, we have to respond to the circumstances that life presents to us, even if we maintain the same fundamental commitment to what it is that life is all about. We still have to adapt that fundamental commitment to what it is that we face each day. And we don't actually know what any given day will bring us in terms of challenges to that search for meaning. And this is what Frankl is talking about. You can see Frankl's philosophical existentialism come through in this second half of the book in a different way than perhaps you saw it come through in the first part of the book. Certainly Frankl's proposal of existentialism is not, in a sense you might say, dark, like you saw with Nietzsche in particular. His is a much brighter sort of existentialism, and the kind of existentialism that you might be more accustomed to meet in those existentialists who are specifically religious. Frankl doesn't talk about religion a whole lot, but it's pretty clear that it's there implicitly in almost everything that he says. So that's the first point that he wants to make on page 99. Now, you notice if you get to page 102, down to the bottom, Frankl notes something that he refers to as existential distress. And he's not by any means saying that all existential distress is bad. Sometimes stress in general is good. I mean, you think about the stress that many of us have experienced with our semester changing and no longer being able to be in class in a normal fashion, and everything being mixed up and having to pursue studies much more on our own, much more alone. It may be that previously you read books when you were around others, or even with others, or even out loud with group activities, and now you're pretty much reading alone. Every situation is different, and I don't know what any of your particular circumstances are, but this is what Frankl is noting here, that these instances that we find of existential distress are opportunities, he could say, for figuring out more clearly what it is that makes these particular circumstances meaningful. Frankl, of course, is explaining his unique psychoanalytic theory. It's called logotherapy. And of course, I think we discussed before, the word logos is essentially a word meaning word or meaning, right? And therapy is obviously that which enables us to be or to return to health. So it's sort of to me like Frankl is describing philosophy in general. This is what philosophy is. Philosophy is the best therapy. Philosophy is meaning therapy. Because philosophy helps us reflect on the most fundamental questions of life. In a lot of our other studies, which are all very good, very necessary, very interesting, crucial to life, we don't always get down into the deepest questions. We don't always get down into the questions that are the most human questions, the most common questions, the questions and the answers to which we can share with anybody, regardless of what their particular area of expertise is. So this is what Frankl is getting to in the very early sections of this second part of the book. For example, on page 105, Frankl says that he considers it to be a dangerous misconception that what we need is equilibrium or a tensionless state. That's not what he says we need. What we actually need, he says, is the striving and the struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. What we need is not just a discharge of tension at any cost, but the call of a potential meaning waiting to be fulfilled. Remember back in the earlier essay, in the first essay, where Frankl is having to talk to a group of prisoners to try to encourage them. And he says it's not so much what we expect from life, but what life expects from us. And this is the same thing that he's referring to here on page 105. Not a discharge of tension at any cost, but rather the call of a potential meaning waiting to be fulfilled. So when each of us reflects on the particular circumstances of our life, when each of us reflects especially on the particular element of our life that we think, and rightfully so, is referred to as suffering, what the focus should be, Frankl is saying, what does that mean? How does that fit into my overall meaningful life? And sometimes, quite honestly, it can be a challenge to figure that out. Sometimes we can experience what Frankl refers to on page 106 as the existential vacuum. It is, as he says, sort of like an emptiness. It often manifests itself, as he mentions at the bottom of page 106, in a state of boredom. Now, I suppose most of us get occasionally bored. I think probably as life goes on, if we really delve deep into the projects of life, we experience serious boredom less and less and less. Now, we might experience, again, just a few moments here and there, but as far as boredom extending over a longer period of time, that probably becomes less because we become more engrossed in activities that we have freely chosen, whether those be activities relating to marriage or children or careers or other external activities like church or community activities or whatever it might be, that we have voluntarily taken on as tasks which we think are worthwhile, commitments which we have made, which once made need to be stuck with and fulfilled. No better example of that than family, of getting married and having children and so forth. But nevertheless, when we're younger, and I remember this, believe it or not, way back when, being younger and being bored. Now, I'll grant you, it's been about 40 years since I've felt seriously bored. And things kind of speeded up about, well, actually a little bit more than that. I remember the summer of 1978 is the last time I've been really, really bored. So that tells you it's a long time ago. But I got involved in some things, and then some other things happened. And it's almost like at the snap of a finger, I turn around and, good grief, it's 2020. You know, where did this span of time actually go? Now I know where it went, but it passed seemingly in a rapid way, although time doesn't speed up or slow down actually, but it passed very meaningfully. So this is what Frankl is talking about in terms of the existential vacuum. It is something serious which needs to be dealt with. It can manifest itself, he says, in various ways. It can manifest itself, for example, as he says on page 107, with various masks and guises. It can appear as something that can be compensated for, as he says here, by the will to money, or the will to power, the will to pleasure. It can sort of have as he mentions explicitly here on page 107, it can have a sexual compensation. And what he's doing here in terms of power and money and sex, he's referring to ways that the human being seems kind of naturally drawn to as an outlet for this, the tension of this boredom and the tension of this existential vacuum. Right? On page 108, he gets very specific about how the meaning of life fits into our lives as we live through day to day. He says, what matters is not the meaning of life in general. Many people either have that worked out or think they do at any rate. What matters is not, he says, the meaning of life in general, but the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. Our life, we just can't sort of say it's meaningful overall, and now that problem's taken care of and there's nothing to worry about forever. Life has to remain meaningful constantly. Life has to remain meaningful in terms of every activity, regardless of how mundane or trivial that activity might be. So your life has to be meaningful right now. Well, you're watching this video about Viktor Frankl in your second to last online philosophy class. All right. In order for that to happen, in order for our life to remain meaningful at every moment, Frankl says we as individuals have to take responsibility. And so he makes a very important statement right in the middle of page 109, logotherapy, he says, sees in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. Now, you can contrast this to what we learned earlier with one of the earlier existentialists. For example, when we were looking at Sartre, if we were to ask Sartre the essence of human existence, he would say, well, there really isn't any. Remember, because his phrase was existence precedes essence, right? So the only thing that Sartre could identify in terms of the essence of the human being was freedom. And Frankl does also identify freedom, but he goes a step further. Freedom is meaningless in Frankl's terms unless it is exercised responsibly. And in order for freedom to be exercised responsibly, that obviously implies some other aspects of what we are as human beings. It obviously implies, now this harks back to what we were looking at in Plato, for example, in the Republic, it implies that there is a specific nature that's associated with the human being. And that nature of the human being encompasses all elements of our life. And it is what it is. It isn't what we think it is sometimes. It isn't what we want it to be necessarily. But nature is what it is. Now, Frankl's not discussing these sort of ancillary philosophical ideas here specifically in this, but certainly his theory of his idea of responsibleness being the essence of human nature would not make sense if he weren't really contradicting what Sartre says fundamentally, and if he weren't sort of taking hold of what Plato says, that nature is a reality that is what it is, regardless of what we might happen to think about it. So right after he gives this phrase, responsibleness is the very essence of human existence, right after he gives that, he gives what he calls the categorical imperative of logotherapy. The word categorical imperative is sort of a name for a rule which can be applied to all actions in all circumstances of life. In your next philosophy class in ethics, you will meet up with another philosopher who formulated a categorical imperative. So when you get there, that term should seem familiar. Now, Frankl's categorical imperative is not the same as the one that you're going to see then. His is very specifically formulated, and so he puts it in quotes on page 109. Study it carefully. Live as if you were living already for a second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. When we are puzzled about what the responsible thing is to do, when we're puzzled about what action is most in line with our human existence, Frankl says, think about this sentence. Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. When we ask this question, obviously we have doubts about whether or not we should be doing what we're thinking about doing. So Frankl says perhaps this question would be a way to reflect on whether or not we ought to take that action. Now then, we need to turn a few pages to, you'll notice I want to call to your attention here on page 112, what in a sense could be called the central notion of the book. Frankl discusses, and the headline says, the meaning of suffering, right? And oftentimes, and he says this in speeches, he says this in other books and so forth, he says the real challenge in life sometimes is how can we turn a predicament into a human achievement? We're no longer able to change a situation. The circumstances are what they are. We can't change that. How can we turn that predicament into a human achievement? And he uses, for example, he says, think of an incurable disease like cancer, right? We can't change that. The challenge is, how do we change ourselves? That is oftentimes a very serious challenge. Now, there's a very interesting little illustration on pages 116 to 118. Frankl is describing an instance. He was in the hospital as a doctor, and he walked into a room where a group therapy session was taking place. And different people were speaking about their circumstances, what was wrong, why they were having problems, why they were in the psychiatric hospital, etc. And we're not really going to have time to go through this in as much detail as I would like to, but I want you to read very carefully. On page 116, there's an element there, a headline there that says logodrama. And it's Frankl asking two women to reflect on their lives at the end of their lives, and what their life's circumstances had been like, and what it was that made for them life meaningful or less than meaningful. I want you to read that very carefully, and what I'm hinting at here is there's probably going to be some kind of question about that coming up on something that we have to go through here before we get to the end of this semester. You all know it as the final exam, right? So read that section called the logodrama very carefully. I think I've already mentioned to you Frankl's movie example. If in order for a movie to be meaningful, you can't edit out too many parts, and the same thing is true of life, right? Now he gives that example on a page which you will find in this second part. One of the most fascinating examples in this second part is the example of Jerry Long. And I have attached to these notes, and at the bottom of the notes, the video of the interview with both Viktor Frankl and Jerry Long. Jerry Long, the story appears back almost towards the end on page 147. He had a diving accident. He's been paralyzed from the neck down since a diving accident which rendered him a quadriplegic. He can, and this has been quite a while ago. You can probably look it up. It says here, the Texarkana Gazette. But he learned to use a mouth stick to type, and he attends courses at a community college via telephone, etc. You can see him on the interview. Jerry Long actually discovered the principles of logotherapy without talking to Viktor Frankl. Jerry Long made a decision that he wasn't going to let the fact that he was a quadriplegic stop his life. And so the phrase, which is kind of a semi-famous phrase, I guess, at least in circles like this, that Jerry Long uttered was, "I broke my neck. It didn't break me." And so we can think about this in terms of any circumstance of suffering that we undergo. It could break a certain part of us. It can keep us from doing certain things which we had previously done. So, for example, we have a physical injury. Let's say we have a very serious physical injury and break our leg. Can't walk, can't run, can't do things in the same way, at least for a while, and sometimes maybe never. Or we have some other condition we might develop later in life. We could develop a heart condition or a lung condition or a mental condition. We could develop an emotional problem. Or it could be the loss of a loved one with whom we were used to associating and whose companionship we will never, ever again experience. So this is what Jerry Long is saying. I broke my neck. It didn't break me. life still can remain meaningful, Frankl is saying, and Jerry Long is affirming as well. Life still can be meaningful, but it's up to us to do it. It's not what we expect from life, remember. It's what life expects from us. It's our choice. If you have an element of life in which there is no meaning, Frankl is saying, put meaning, and there you will find meaning. It very much echoes a phrase found in St. John of the Cross, where there is no love, put love, and there you will find love. And Frankl saying very much the same thing. Where there is no meaning, put meaning, and there you will find meaning. So I suppose the bottom line, or sort of coming to the end of our time, is that life can be meaningful under any circumstances, but it's up to us to make it so. Now in the next class, ladies and gentlemen, we will sort of wrap a few things up and do a little bit of review, and I'll tell you, I'll give you the details with regard to the final exam and how that's going to work and so forth. So, in the meantime, I wish you well. Enjoy your reading here of Viktor Frankl. Again, I want to emphasize, don't get rid of this book. Hang on to this for the rest of your life and reread at least parts of it every few years. If you do nothing else, pick it up randomly over the next few years and just open it up randomly and just see just where your eyes happen to land, or read a few pages here and there. But I can absolutely guarantee, I make very few absolute guarantees in life, but I can absolutely guarantee that you will find this book meaningful and useful and enlightening and helpful in your reflections about life for as long as you live. So, until next time.